So welcome back to Unit 7, Cognition. We are on Module 35, Solving Problems and Making Decisions. I know I say this with a lot of the modules, but this one is really important, both within this class and if you're taking AP Psychology. And it is also very important in terms of your own life and thinking about how you solve problems and make decisions and what may actually interfere with your problem solving and decision making, and being able to notice it in others as well. Really fascinating stuff in this module. It is fairly long, I'd say more medium length. We've got 5 learning targets for module 35. The first being describing the cognitive strategies that assist our problem solving, and then those obstacles that hinder it. And I find the obstacles very fascinating to think about and kind of find within ourselves when we run into those obstacles. Second, you should be able to discuss the meaning of intuition. What is intuition? And describe how different heuristics influence our decisions and judgments. You should be able to discuss the factors that exaggerate our fear of unlikely events, another fascinating thing to really consider. You should be able to describe how our decisions and judgments are affected by things like overconfidence, belief, perseverance, and framing. And then finally, you should be able to understand how smart thinkers use intuition to their advantage. So what are 2 problem-solving strategies? When we have a problem, what do? We often utilize an algorithm or a heuristic. An algorithm is a methodical, logical rule or step-by-step procedure that guarantees solving a particular problem. So going through sort of a step-by-step process in problem solving. Whereas a heuristic is a mental shortcut. It's a simple thinking strategy that allows us to make judgments and solve problems efficiently. It's usually much speedier than algorithms, but much more prone to error as well. So how about to make an example of an algorithm versus a heuristic? So an algorithm, when asked to open an unused locker in a school hallway, you try every combination in order, right? That would be going step by step by step by step by step, right? You can imagine that would take a really long time. So you might come up with a shortcut. A heuristic, when asked to open the locker, you stop by the main office to see if the secretary has a list of combinations for each locker. How about the concept of insight? In contrast to those strategy-based solutions, insight is a sudden realization of a problem solution rather than, those utilizing an algorithm or heuristic. And sometimes when you're trying to figure out a problem, it seems like there's no problem-solving strategy at work at all. And we kind of arrive to this solution with like a, aha, I got it, without any sort of learning that is apparent, right? So this kind of goes against what, some of the behaviors that we learned about in earlier modules would be thinking in terms of how we learn, right? There would have to be some sort of conditioning or punishment or reinforcement, but this kind of insight just happens. It just sort of a sudden realization. It strikes suddenly with no prior sense of sort of getting warmer or being shaped or whatever. You kind of just come up with a solution. So we know this happens within ourselves, right? It's probably easy for you to step back and say, yeah, of course, sometimes I just kind of comes to me, things come to me, answers come to me, and I don't have to really go through this process of problem solving too much. But how about with animals? Is there evidence that it happens with animals? Well, we'll be talking about that in a second, but first we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the research on insight says with humans. In one study, researchers asked people to think of a word that forms a compound word or phrase with 3 words, such as pun, crab, and sauce, and to press a button to sound a bell when they knew the answer. And it seemed like a sudden aha insight led to about 50% of the solutions when this research was conducted. So what was happening in the human brain when this insight occurred? Where were things lighting up in terms of the neural imaging? So before the aha moment, the problem solver's frontal lobes involved in focusing attention were active. At the instant of discovery, there was a burst of activity in the right temporal lobe, just above the ear. You can see where it's highlighted on this image. Now we was a little out of order. Now we will be talking a little bit about some research on insight with non-human animals. Some fascinating stuff done by psychologist Wolfgang Kohler, who was working with a chimpanzee named Sultan. And he placed a piece of fruit and a long stick outside of a cage beyond the reach of Sultan. Inside the cage, Kohler placed a short stick, which Sultan grabbed and tried to reach the fruit unsuccessfully. So after several attempts, Sultan dropped the stick and sort of just looked at the situation. And suddenly, as if having one of those aha moments, Sultan jumped up, seized the short stick, and used it to pull in the longer stick, which he then used to reach the fruit. So he had this aha moment. So it seems like the insight is not a fundamentally human-only attribute, that there are also other non-human animals that exhibit insight. So what are some obstacles to problem solving? These three concepts are very interesting to think about in terms of our own thinking: confirmation bias, fixation, and mental set. Confirmation bias is probably the most commonly known, and it's common obstacle for sure. Confirmation bias is a tendency to search for information that supports our preconceptions and to ignore or distort contradictory evidence. Happens all the time. I continuously try not to fall prey to this cognitive distortion, but it happens to me as well. And I am fascinated by it, how much it unfolds within social media, right? That we seek out only information that supports our own biases, and we sort of ignore or distort contradictory evidence. So why we look only for supporting evidence? It leads us to seek this cognitive bias, the confirmation bias that happens, leads us to seek evidence for ideas more eagerly than we seek evidence against them. So it's easy to get in that right line, right? It's easy to say, well, I want to hear what confirms what I believe. I'm going to get in this comforting lies line. Hearing those inconvenient, unpleasant truths is really problematic for some of us, right? It's really hard to hear things that go against what our firmly held beliefs are. Fixation, on the other hand, is the inability to see a problem from a new perspective. And it's definitely an obstacle to problem solving. We kind of approach a problem in the same way that we've always approached the problem. It's really hard for us, for our cognitive systems, to look at a problem in a new way, right? We approach it in the same way we've approached it in the past. An example of fixation is mental set. Our tendency to approach a problem with the mindset of what has worked for us previously, right? So we get to whatever problem we're encountering in life, and we kind of have this little bit of tunnel vision of only being able to see what has worked for us in the past. It's hard for us to come up with different types of solutions. So what is intuition? Intuition can be really good, right? Or really bad. Intuition is an effortless, immediate, automatic feeling or thought, as contrasted with explicit, conscious reasoning. So we have two different intuitive mental shortcuts that we're going to discuss. Representativeness heuristic. Remember the idea of heuristic. When you think heuristic, you should be thinking it's just a mental shortcut. And then there's representativeness heuristic and availability heuristic. Representative heuristic is estimating the likelihood of events in terms of how well they seem to represent or match particular prototypes. And it may lead us to ignore other relevant information. So the availability heuristic, on the other hand, is estimating the likelihood of events based on their availability in memory. So what kind of think about? What comes to mind readily because of maybe the vividness? It makes us think that such events are common. So what's the problem with these mental shortcuts? That sounds like it should be something that's really helpful. But the representative heuristic can lead to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, according to research. So consider the reaction of some non-Arab travelers soon after September 11th happened, when a young male of Arab descent boarded their plane. The young man fit the represented whatever their terrorist prototype was, based on the very vivid recollection of 9/11 having just happened, and that representativeness heuristic kicks in, right? The presence of this person evoked anxiety among fellow passengers, even though nearly 100% of those who fit the prototype are peace-loving citizens. So it can be really problematic, right? We have to think about that. We have to think about how this heuristic can lead to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Another example, one mother of 2 Black and 3 white teens asked other parents, do store personnel follow your children when they're picking out their Gatorade flavors? They didn't follow my white kids. So do your kids get pulled out of the TSA line for additional screening? This mother said, my white kids didn't. So if people have a prototype, which is basically a stereotype for a particular category of delinquent teens, of what terrorists are like, they might unconsciously use the representative heuristic when judging individuals, and it may not be overt, right? Even if unintended, this can result in racism because we have these cognitive biases going on within our brain. So we just have to make ourselves aware that this can be happening. So how can the representative heuristic aid in problem solving? So if a young man, say, wants to win the affections of a young woman, he may notice that she loves basketball. She wears Celtics jersey to school. She fits the young man's idea of an athlete. And so he thinks, I could maybe get her to go out with me if I buy tickets to the NBA finals. Wow, yeah, that would probably work. And he asks if she wants to go. His behavior buying the tickets is based on how well the young woman represents his idea, that concept of sport-loving athlete. He believes she will say yes, right? And in the same example, the textbook authors are saying, of course she does. So how about the availability heuristic? It's estimating the likelihood of events based on how fast they come to mind, their availability in memory. If instances come readily to mind, perhaps because of their vividness, we presume such events are common. We often fear the wrong things. In 2015 and again in 2016, feared Islamic terrorists shot and killed fewer Americans than did armed toddlers, right? But it's so vivid in our mind, these things, right? It's so vivid and so available in our memory that we have more fear about those kind of things. And the bumper sticker, don't believe everything you think. We really have to catch ourselves. We really have to think about our own thinking in terms of why we're believing what we're believing or why we fear the things that we fear. Sometimes our fears about certain things are not completely accurate. And these next couple slides are going to talk about that. So what are we afraid of? In the 3 months after 9/11, fear of flying led more Americans to travel by car and some to die. Okay, so you can see a little bit on this visual about the number of deaths and the average number of traffic deaths. And makes us really think about, if you think about driving or flying, there's to think about, personally, I love flying, but I've met many, many people throughout my life who do have a fear of flying. Well, should we? I've never met anyone, I mean, I kind of met people that are afraid of driving, but not to the same extent of flying, right? And it turns out that driving is more dangerous. There are more traffic deaths. And you're more likely to, of course, there are more traffic deaths because there are more cars, but they're more likely to be in a traffic accident than in an airplane accident. But because of these different cognitive mechanisms happening, we are much more likely as humans to fear flying. So why do we fear the wrong things? We fear what our ancestral history has prepared us to fear. Snakes, lizards, spiders combined now kill a tiny fraction of the number killed by modern day threats, such as cars and cigarettes. But these ancestral risks also prepare us to fear confinement and heights. So that's how it relates to the flying that we talked about on the previous slide. And even though we really don't have much reason to be afraid of, those pests, the snakes, the lizards, and the spiders, many of us, myself included, strangely, still fear them if they're in our house, right? Or in our yard. We see spiders. I just saw a spider this past weekend, and I'm just like, right? And then I think about it, I'm like, why, unless it's a poisonous spider, which most aren't, right? Why are we really fearing those spiders? There's something else going on. And, thinking about our ancestral history can help us explain and understand that. The second thing is that we fear more what we cannot control. While we're driving, we feel under much more control. Or we're flying, we do not, okay? We fear what is immediate. Dangers of flying are mostly in the moments of takeoff and landing. Dangers of driving are spread across many moments, each trivially dangerous. Thanks to the availability heuristic, we fear what is most readily available in memory. So like shark attacks, okay? I'm totally guilty of this. I grew up, I was born in the late 1970s, and I grew up watching way too many Jaws movies, and I developed a serious fear of sharks that actually still exists within me today. And a lot of that has to do with the vivid imagery, right? Because shark attacks are not common. It's not likely that I'm going to be attacked by a shark, but it is still something that I fear when I go, when I jump in the ocean. On the other hand, I'm not that fearful of heart disease, and look how many Americans are killed by heart disease each year, right? It's harder to visualize. It's harder to bring that to mind, even though logically I know how many people are killed by heart disease. People may fear sharks more than cigarettes or the effects of an unhealthy diet, according to research. How are our decisions and judgments affected by overconfidence? So overconfidence is exactly what it sounds like, the tendency to be more confident than correct. We overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs and judgment often. Sometimes our decisions and judgments go awry because we are more confident than correct. Overconfidence can lead to a planning fallacy, overestimating our future leisure time and income. I have this happen all the time. I totally underestimate how much time things are going to take, right? Often I think, oh, I just have this much to get done, and it's only going to take me a couple hours, and it ends up taking me like 3 days. That's pretty common, actually. Students and others often expect to finish assignments ahead of schedule, and in fact, the projects take much longer, maybe twice as much as the predicted time. Anticipating how much more time we'll have next month, we happily accept invitations. Another problem I have, right? Like, I think I want to take on more, I want to help people, I want to volunteer for things, and I'll say, sure, I can do that next month, sure, I can do that next month, and then it all adds up, and I don't have enough time to do everything. And that's, again, fairly common. What happens to some people is they believe they will have more money next year, right? They think, okay, next year I'm going to have more money, so I'm going to take out a loan right now because I want this right now. And I know next year I should be getting this amount of money. And so we take out loans or buy on credit, which can, of course, be problematic because we have this overconfidence generally that we are going to make more money than we end up making. Belief perseverance is clinging to one's initial conceptions after the basis on which they were formed has been discredited. Fascinating phenomenon, again, that you can see play out on social media all the time. The more we come to appreciate why our beliefs might be true, the more tightly we cling to them. For instance, in politics, again, on social media, you see this all the time. Once we've explained to ourselves why candidate X or Y will be a better commander-in-chief, we tend to ignore evidence undermining our belief. This happens on both sides of the political spectrum, right? For left-leaning people and right-leaning people, to even people somewhat in the middle, right? Once we come to believe in, candidate X versus candidate Y, we tend to ignore evidence about why candidate X might not be a good candidate and why candidate Y might be a good candidate. So how about research in this area? A classic study of belief perseverance engaged people with opposing views of capital punishment, a really polarizing issue in many cases. After studying two supposedly new research findings, one supporting and the other refuting the claim that the death penalty deters crime, each side was more impressed by the study supporting their own beliefs. And each readily disputed the other study, right? So they read the studies and felt like, oh, wow, they really were more impressed by the one that kind of said, supported whatever beliefs they had going into the study. So what's the takeaway from this research? Showing the pro and anti-capital punishment groups the same mixed evidence, so showing them evidence for and against their positions, actually increased their disagreement. So that's really problematic, right? We think oftentimes we might strongly have a really strong opinion about something. We think, gosh, if the other side could just see some evidence, they would just be able to read some evidence about why we believe what we believe, they will change their mind. Well, that seems to not be that true. Rather than using evidence to draw conclusions, the people in this study used their own conclusions to assess the evidence. And this phenomenon is called motivated reasoning. Another interesting concept to think about that affects our problem-solving abilities is the concept of framing. The way an issue is posed, how an issue is worded can significantly affect our decisions and judgments. So think about the way these next things are framed, which sounds like something you might agree with. Gun safety or gun control laws, undocumented workers or illegal aliens. You know, some of these have much more negative versus positive sort of connotations in our mind. Carbon offset fee or carbon tax. So how words or how concepts are framed can have a big, big effect, a large effect on how we think about them and how we go about problem solving when we're thinking about them. So framing, the way we present an issue, can be a powerful tool of persuasion that is used a lot to sort of frame by marketers, by politicians, by lots of different people trying to get us to believe what they're believing. So imagine two surgeons explaining the risks of an upcoming surgery. One explains that during this type of surgery, 10% of people die. You might go, oh, 10% of people die, oh my goodness. The other explains that 90% survive. The information is the same, but the effect is not. In real life surveys, patients and physicians overwhelmingly say the risk is greater when they hear that 10% die. Even though the information is the same, the way it's presented matters in how people feel about the risk of the surgery. So how do smart thinkers use intuition? Implicit knowledge that we've recorded in our brains but can't fully explain shows itself in the smart and quick judgments of people like nurses, firefighters, car mechanics. To make adaptive and quick decisions, intuition allows us to go with our gut, which can be good, but it can be problematic, right? Going with our gut, recognizing stranger danger. You know, I talk about it with my own kids, right? Like, go with your gut. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, there's a stranger, you know, you have to go with your gut in that instant, and it can be really adaptive and help you make quick decisions, but it can also be problematic. Our mind's unconscious track makes good use intuitively of what we are not consciously processing. Unconscious, automatic influences are constantly affecting our judgments. So we have to realize that going on in our brain all the time are these automatic influences that are affecting how we judge things. So putting this all together, everything that we've gone over in this module, letting a problem incubate while we attend to other things can pay dividends. Facing a difficult decision involving a lot of facts, we're wise to gather all the information we can and then say, give me some time not to think about it, right? We don't want to stew over it and stew over it and stew over it. I take in the information, gather all the information I can. Now let's think about it. Even better, let's sleep on it. Thanks to our brain always being active even when we're sleeping, the non-conscious thinking, reasoning, problem-solving, decision-making, planning can be surprisingly astute. So putting all the information, gathering all the information that you have to make a decision, and then giving yourself some time to kind of think about something else and sleep on it can be really, really an effective way to problem solve. So this is a good chart from the textbook, the Myers Psychology for the AP Course 3rd edition, which is the one that these modules are aligned to. This is a good chart to look at, kind of to go over the different processes or strategies, you know, the algorithm, the methodical rule or procedure that guarantees a solution, but it requires time and effort. Or heuristics, which are those mental shortcuts. And they let us act quickly, but they put us at risk for errors. We can also have insight, which is that sudden aha reaction, can provide an instant realization of a solution, but oftentimes that insight doesn't happen. So what are some of the problems that can be involved in our problem solving, the difficulties, the things that interfere? The concept of confirmation bias might be the most common, is the tendency to search for support for our own views and ignore contradictory evidence. So it lets us quickly recognize supporting evidence, but it hinders us, hinders our thinking, hinders our recognition of contradictory evidence. Fixation is another concept that was really important that we talked about. The inability to view problems from a new angle, right? We focus thinking on familiar solutions, but it of course hinders our creative problem solving. Intuition is that fast, automatic feeling and thought. Can be really helpful. It's based on our experience. Can be very adaptive, but it can lead us to sort of overfeel and underthink. That's a really good way of putting it. The concept of intuition. Overconfidence, we overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs and judgments, usually. Allows us to be happy and to make decisions easily, but it puts us at a big risk for errors. Belief perseverance is ignoring evidence that proves our beliefs are wrong. It's really, the power of it is that it supports our enduring beliefs, but it closes our mind to new ideas. Framing is wording a question or statement so that it evokes a desired response. You'll see this on surveys, you'll see this from politicians, you'll see this from everyone, right? People put things worded in certain ways to make you respond in a certain way. Can influence, really does influence other people's decisions, can produce a misleading result. Finally, creativity is the ability to innovate and have valuable ideas. Wasn't talked about as much in this module, but can help us produce new insights and products, right? You don't want to get stuck with any of these, get fixated and not come up with new ideas. You want to be able to produce new insights and products to problem solve in the best way. But it can be a little bit destructive in terms of structured work and routines. So to review our learning targets, describe the cognitive strategies that assist our problem solving and the obstacles that hinder it. An algorithm is a methodical, logical rule or procedure that guarantees a solution to a problem, like a step-by-step problem solving strategy. A heuristic is that mental shortcut, a simple thinking strategy that is usually speedier, but is more error prone. It can result in both correct and incorrect solutions. So insight is not a strategy-based solution, but rather a sudden flash of inspiration that solves a problem. Obstacles to our problem solving include confirmation bias, which predisposes us to verify rather than challenge our hypothesis. Fixation, such as mental set, which prevents us from taking the fresh perspective that could lead to a solution. Intuition is the effortless, immediate, automatic feeling or thoughts we often use instead of systematic reasoning. Can be positive, often is very positive, but can be negative. Heuristics enable snap judgments, which can result in correct or incorrect decisions. The two types of heuristics discussed in this module, representativeness heuristic leads us to judge the likelihood of things in terms of how they represent our prototype for a group of items. The availability heuristic, with that one, we judge the likelihood of things based on how readily they come to mind, which may lead us to fear the wrong things, like flying versus driving in a car. We fear often what our ancestral history has prepared us to fear, even though these risks may no longer be what we should be fearing. We fear what we cannot control, we fear what is immediate, and we fear what is most readily available in memory. We remember and fear disasters more than ongoing, less dramatic events. As I said with my example, growing up watching too many Jaws movies, I'm much more likely to fear sharks and heart disease, although I should be much more fearful of heart disease. Overconfidence can lead us to overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs. When we have a belief that's already formed and explained that it has been discredited, belief perseverance may cause us to cling to that belief. A remedy is to consider how we might have explained an opposite result. Framing is the way a question or statement is presented. Subtle differences in presentation can dramatically alter our responses in terms of how we respond based on how the question is asked. Finally, smart thinkers welcome their intuitions, which are usually adaptive, but they also know when they should override them. So it's knowing when to use your intuitions, knowing when your intuitions are adaptive processes versus knowing when you should take a different approach. When making complex decisions, we may benefit from gathering as much information as possible and then taking time to let our mind process it without thinking about it. As people gain expertise, they grow adept at making quicker, more shrewd judgments. Okay, so that was a pretty long module, longer than I was thinking. Thank you for listening and take care.